They gave me a paralyzed man as a husband. I never expected he would teach me how to stand. The rain hammered against the wooden walls of the little church in Timber Ridge, Tennessee, on that September morning in 1887. Inside, Sarah Coleman stood beside a wheelchair carved from solid oak, her 7.5-month pregnant belly pressing against the worn fabric of her only decent dress. Her hand rested on the shoulder of the man sitting below her, not from affection, but because standing for long periods made her back scream with pain. Jacob McKenna sat motionless in that chair he had built with his own hands. At 35 years old, he was still a mountain of a man. His shoulders were broad as an axe handle, his arms thick with the kind of muscle that came from years of felling trees in the Smoky Mountains. His beard was dark and full, hanging halfway down his chest. His hair, equally dark, touched his shoulders. His hands, resting on the wooden armrests, were massive things, calloused and scarred from a lifetime of hard labor. But his legs, hidden beneath a wool blanket, hung useless. Around his waist, he wore a wide leather belt. Attached to it was a hunting knife in a worn sheath and a coil of rope, the tools of a woodsman, the symbols of who he had been before a falling tree had crushed his spine 6 months earlier. Pastor Ezra Whitfield stood before them, his weathered face kind but solemn. He was 62 years old and had married more couples than he could count, but never two people quite like these. A widow, 8 months pregnant with another man's child. A crippled logger who most folks thought would never provide for anyone again. "Do you, Jacob McKenna, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Jacob's voice came low and steady, like distant thunder in the mountains. "I may not stand, but I keep my word. I do." Sarah looked down at him, and for the first time since her husband Daniel had died in the same logging accident that had broken Jacob, she felt something other than despair. She did not see the wheelchair. She saw the steady brown eyes looking up at her, eyes that had seen pain and survived it. "Do you, Sarah Coleman, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" "I do." The ring Jacob slipped onto her finger was simple silver, slightly too large. His enormous hands moved with surprising gentleness as he guided it into place. Sarah bent down, and their lips met briefly, awkwardly. She tasted rain and wood smoke. He smelled of pine and leather. The 30 people gathered in the small church applauded quietly. It was not the joyous celebration of a love match. It was the respectful acknowledgement of two people doing what needed to be done to survive. Outside, Jacob's modified wagon waited in the rain. He had designed it himself in the months after his injury. The reins were attached to a hand-operated steering mechanism. Where his legs could no longer work the brake, his powerful arms controlled everything. He transferred himself from the wheelchair to the wagon seat with practiced efficiency, muscles bunching and flexing beneath his shirt. Sarah climbed up beside him, moving carefully with her swollen belly. Behind them, on a second horse, rode Caleb Morrison, Sarah's 16-year-old nephew. The boy's father, Daniel, had been Sarah's husband. Now the orphaned teenager was part of this strange new family that none of them had chosen. "How far up this mountain?" Sarah asked as the wagon began to climb the narrow trail leading away from town. "Far enough. City folks don't bother us," Jacob replied. "I'm not city folk. I'm just folk." The corner of Jacob's mouth twitched. It was not quite a smile, but close. "Good. We need folk." Caleb rode silently behind them, leading a pack horse loaded with Sarah's meager possessions. Everything she owned in the world fit on one animal. The trail climbed steadily for 3 miles. The rain turned the path to mud, but Jacob's hands never wavered on the reins. His arms, strengthened by months of pulling himself around without the use of his legs, guided the horse with absolute confidence. When they finally reached the cabin, Sarah caught her breath. It sat in a clearing carved from the forest, built entirely of oak logs that Jacob had cut and shaped himself. 2 stories tall, with a stone chimney rising from the center. But what caught her attention was the gentle ramp leading to the front door, instead of steps. The doorway was wider than normal. The threshold was level with the porch. He had built this place for a wheelchair. Inside, Sarah's amazement grew. Everything was within reach from a sitting position. The kitchen counters were lower than standard. The shelves were positioned perfectly for someone who could not stand. The fireplace had a stone hearth that extended out, creating a flat surface at exactly the right height. But in the corner, near the fire's warmth, stood something that made Sarah's throat tighten. A cradle. It was carved from black walnut, the wood polished to a deep glow. On the headboard, Jacob had carved images of forest animals: a deer, a bear, an owl. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, each detail precise and lifelike. "You made this," she said softly. Jacob wheeled closer. "Figured the baby would need somewhere to sleep." It was the first indication that he had prepared for her arrival with more than practical necessity. He had prepared with care. That night, Jacob cooked. Sarah watched in amazement as he moved around the kitchen with fluid efficiency, his wheelchair rolling smoothly across the wooden floor. He had designed the space perfectly. Everything he needed was within arm's reach. He built up the fire, hung a pot of venison stew over the flames, and mixed cornbread in a wooden bowl balanced on his lap. "You cook?" Sarah asked. "Living alone teaches you, or starves you." It was the first hint of humor she had heard from him. She felt her shoulders, which had been tight with anxiety for months, begin to relax slightly. They ate in near silence, the only sounds the crackling fire and the rain on the roof. Caleb sat with them, wolfing down the food with the enthusiasm of a growing boy. "Uncle Jacob, can I sleep in the loft?" "That's yours. I already set it up for you." Caleb looked surprised. "You did?" "Been expecting you both for weeks. Pastor Ezra told me you were coming." After dinner, Sarah tried to stand and clear the table. Pain shot through her lower back, and she gasped. Immediately, Jacob was there, his hand on her arm. "You rest. I clean. I'm not a guest. You're my wife. And you're carrying more weight than I'll ever move again." The words hung in the air between them. Sarah realized he had meant it literally, referring to the baby, but it sounded like something deeper, something about burden and responsibility and the weight of living. "I mean the baby," Jacob clarified, his face reddening slightly. "It's heavy work, growing a person." Sarah felt laughter bubble up, surprising herself. Yes, it is." That night, Sarah lay in the bed Jacob had built, in the room he had prepared, listening to the rain and the sound of him moving around in the main room below. She placed her hand on her belly and felt the baby kick. This was not the life she had imagined, but perhaps, she thought, it was the life she needed. In the morning, Sarah woke to find Jacob already up, stoking the fire. She rose carefully and found her way to the small table where he kept his papers and ledgers. What she saw made her blood run cold. The financial records were a disaster. Jacob owed money to nearly a dozen people in town. But the largest debt, circled in red ink, was $350 owed to someone named Silas Hardwick, due in 3 months. "You owe Hardwick $350? She asked when Jacob rolled into the room. He stopped, his face unreadable. Yes. And you owe Widow Ruth $40, and Henderson $25. They needed help, and you needed to be needed. Jacob's eyes met hers, and she saw surprise there. You read me fast. I read numbers faster. She tapped the ledger. This is a catastrophe. $350 in 3 months? What's your income? Had income. Past tense. Can't fell trees from a chair. Sarah sat down heavily. Then how? Jacob wheeled to a cabinet Sarah had not noticed. He opened it and withdrew several carved wooden objects. A bear, standing on its hind legs, every hair detailed. A hawk with wings spread. A woman's face, serene and beautiful. The craftsmanship was breathtaking. I used to sell these, Jacob said quietly. Before. They reminded me of who I was. I couldn't stand to make them anymore. Sarah picked up the bear carving, feeling the smooth wood under her fingers. They don't remind me of who you were. They remind me of who you are. Something shifted in Jacob's face, a wall coming down, just slightly. I'll manage the money, Sarah said. You decide who we help, but we do it smart. We don't go under trying to save everyone else. Jacob extended his large hand. Deal. They shook on it, and Sarah felt the roughness of his palm, the strength in his grip. This was partnership, not romance, not yet, perhaps not ever, but partnership, and that was something solid to build on. 2 days later, their fragile peace was shattered. The sound of horses outside brought them both to attention. Through the window, Sarah saw 5 men approaching. Leading them was a heavy-set man in expensive clothes, his face flushed and cruel. Silas Hardwick. Jacob wheeled to the door, but Sarah beat him there. She stepped out onto the porch, placing herself between the mounted men and her husband. "Heard you got married, Bear," Hardwick said, using Jacob's old nickname from his logging days. "Smart move, before I take this land." "You'll get your money," Jacob said from behind Sarah. Hardwick's eyes moved to Sarah, traveling up and down her pregnant body with insulting slowness. "Pretty thing. Hope she's good with numbers. You'll need miracles." "We have 3 months," Sarah said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. Hardwick pulled a paper from his coat. "Actually, my contract says I can call the debt early if circumstances change materially." "You got married. Circumstances changed." He tossed the contract toward the porch. It landed in the mud. 3 months, Hardwick repeated. "Then everything you built becomes mine. All this old growth timber, worth a fortune." He turned his horse, and the men followed, their laughter floating back through the rain. Sarah bent awkwardly to retrieve the muddy contract. Back inside, she spread it on the table and read, her finger tracing the cramped legal language. "He's right," she said finally. "This clause lets him call the debt if your situation changes substantially." Jacob's hands gripped his wheelchair arms. "I signed that when I was whole. Didn't think I'd need to worry about getting married while crippled." Sarah looked at him. "We fight this legally, and we find a way to make that money." "How?" Jacob's voice was bitter. "I can't work." "No," Sarah said, "but your hands can. Those carvings, we sell them. We find customers. We build something." Jacob stared at her, and Sarah saw something ignite in his eyes. Not hope, not yet, but something close, the refusal to surrender. The next morning, Caleb rode down to town and returned with widow Ruth Blackwell. The 55-year-old woman ran a basket-making business and had known Jacob since he was a boy. "I need skilled work," she said without preamble, settling into the chair across from Jacob. "My hands are getting too arthritic for the fine details. I heard you're carving again." Jacob showed her his work. Ruth examined each piece with the eye of a professional craftswoman. "Best work I've seen in 20 years, she said. "I'll pay you 30% of sale price to finish my basket handles and decorative elements." 40%, Sarah interjected, "and you provide materials." Ruth's eyes snapped to Sarah, then back to Jacob. "She deals?" "She deals," Jacob confirmed. Ruth's face split into a grin. 40%. You've got yourself a partnership, Bear." After she left, Sarah turned to Jacob. "When you can't stand alone, you build with others." Jacob looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time since their wedding. "You're going to save this place, aren't you?" "We are," Sarah corrected. "Together." Outside, the rain continued to fall. But inside the cabin on the mountain, something was beginning to grow. Not love, not yet, but something equally important: hope. The work began before dawn. For 2 weeks, the cabin filled with the smell of fresh cut wood and the sound of Jacob's carving tools biting into oak and walnut. Sarah sat beside him, weaving thin strips of willow into the basket frames, while he carved handles decorated with vines and leaves. Caleb ranged through the forest, gathering the materials they needed. The rhythm became their language. Jacob's hands moved with a precision that seemed impossible for their size. Each stroke of the knife revealed something hidden in the wood. A curl of bark became a rose petal. A knot became an owl's eye. Sarah watched him work and understood that this was more than craft. This was how Jacob spoke when words failed him. By the end of the second week, they had completed 5 baskets. Widow Ruth arrived to collect them, running her weathered fingers over Jacob's carved handles with something close to reverence. "Best craftsmanship I've seen in 30 years, she murmured. "I can sell these in Knoxville for triple what I'd get for my regular work." She counted out $60 in gold coins. Real money. The first income Jacob had earned since the accident. Sarah immediately recorded it in the ledger. 60 toward 350. We need more orders. Within days, word spread through Timber Ridge. The crippled logger was making art. People came to see for themselves, drawn by curiosity, and stayed because of beauty. A hotel in Charleston ordered 50 picnic baskets for their guests. The payment would be $300, enough to clear the debt to Hardwick with money to spare, but physically impossible for one man to complete in 6 weeks. "We need help," Sarah said. Jacob's jaw tightened. "I don't take charity." "It's not charity. It's business. You pay them for their labor." The words hung between them. Finally, Jacob nodded. His pride was bending, slowly, to necessity. They hired 3 young men from town to help with the rough work. Jacob designed the pieces and carved the detailed elements. The others assembled and finished. It was a system. It was working. Then the letter arrived. The mail courier from Knoxville brought it on a cold October morning. The envelope was thick, expensive paper. The return address read, Dr. Marcus Henley, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Inside was a photograph. Sarah found it while sorting the mail. The image showed Jacob standing tall beside a massive fallen tree, an axe over his shoulder. His legs were strong and straight. His stance was confident. On the back, someone had written the date, July 1885, 2 years ago. But it was the letter tucked behind the photograph that made Sarah's hands shake. Mr. McKenna, it read. My experimental treatment showed 70% recovery potential 4 months post-injury. Patients with your specific spinal compression often regain significant function with continued therapy. You left treatment after only 6 weeks. The sensation you reported in your lower extremities should continue to improve. Why did you stop? Please return for assessment at your earliest convenience. Sarah read it 3 times. Then she walked outside to where Jacob was working in his small barn workshop. You can feel your legs? Jacob's hands froze on the piece of wood he was carving. He did not turn around. Sometimes. You can feel them, and you're still in that chair? Now he turned. His face was a mask of pain and something else. Shame, perhaps, or fear. Sarah, it's not that simple. Then make it simple. She thrust the letter at him. This doctor says you could walk, that you were getting better. Why did you stop treatment? Jacob took the letter. His huge hands made the paper look fragile. Because I was terrified. The words came out quietly, but they hit Sarah like a physical blow. Of what? Of walking? Of hoping. Jacob's voice roughened. You don't understand. For 3 months after the accident, I had nothing. No feeling, no movement, nothing below my waist. Then Dr. Henley tried his electrical therapy, and I started to feel things. Pinpricks, warmth, then actual sensation. He paused, his throat working. For 2 weeks, I let myself believe I'd be whole again, that I'd go back to being Bear McKenna, the man who could fell a tree faster than anyone, the man who had everything. What happened? Progress stopped. For a week, nothing changed. I couldn't make my legs move no matter how hard I tried, and I realized something. What? That I couldn't survive hoping and failing again. So I left, came back here, told everyone I was permanently paralyzed, built my life around this chair. Because a cage you choose is better than a cage you fight and lose to. Sarah sat down heavily on a workbench. The baby kicked inside her, as if responding to her churning emotions. So you chose this. You chose to stay broken. I chose to stop hurting. And you let me marry you, thinking you had no choice, thinking you were helpless. Jacob flinched as if she had struck him. I never said I was helpless. You never said you could get better. The shout echoed in the small barn. Outside, she heard Caleb's footsteps pause, then quietly move away, giving them privacy. Sarah pressed her hands to her face. She wanted to scream, to rage, to demand why he had not been honest. But beneath the anger was something else, understanding. She lowered her hands. If there was a chance, even a small one, that you could walk again, would you take it? Jacob looked at his legs, still covered by the ever-present blanket. I don't know if I can. Not can you. Would you? For yourself. For this child. Sarah placed her hand on her belly. Would you try? The silence stretched between them. Finally, Jacob spoke. I'm scared. Good, Sarah said. Do it anyway. Try. Right now. Sarah. No. Right now. If you can feel your legs, prove it. Show me. Jacob stared at her. Then, slowly, he reached down and pulled the blanket aside. His legs were thinner than they had been, muscles wasted from months of disuse. But they were there, whole, at least in appearance. Jacob gripped the arms of his wheelchair and transferred himself to the floor. Sarah watched, barely breathing, as he positioned himself on his back. I haven't tried this in months, he said. "Try now." Jacob closed his eyes, his face contorted with concentration. For long seconds, nothing happened. Then his right foot twitched. It was barely visible, just a small flexing of the ankle, but it was movement. "Again," Sarah whispered. Jacob's breath came in gasps. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the October chill. His right knee bent just slightly, maybe an inch. Sarah dropped to her knees beside him. "Can you feel that?" "Everything?" Jacob's voice broke. "I can feel everything." His left leg trembled. The muscles were trying to respond but failing. Jacob pushed harder, veins standing out on his neck with the effort. His right leg, stronger, bent more. 6 inches this time. His foot pressed against the floor. Then both legs moved together. Not much. Not enough to stand. But enough to prove that the connection was there, that the nerves were firing, that the impossible might not be impossible after all. Jacob collapsed back, sobbing. Great, wrenching sounds torn from somewhere deep in his chest. Sarah gathered him to her as best she could, her pregnant belly awkward between them. "You felt it," she said into his hair. "You moved them. But what if it doesn't get better? What if this is all I ever get back?" "Then we deal with that. But at least you tried." They stayed there on the barn floor for a long time. Outside, the October sun climbed higher. Inside, 2 people who had married as strangers held each other and cried for different reasons. Jacob for fear, Sarah for hope. When they finally pulled apart, Sarah helped Jacob back into his chair. His face was red and puffy, his eyes swollen. He looked vulnerable in a way she had never seen. "We don't tell anyone yet," he said. "Not until I know what's possible." "Agreed. But you keep trying. Every day." "Every day," he promised. That evening, as Sarah prepared dinner and Jacob carved by the fire, a shadow appeared in the doorway. Cherokee Joe stepped inside without knocking. The 70-year-old Cherokee man moved with the quiet grace of someone who had spent his entire life in these mountains. His face was weathered as old leather, his hair white as snow. He had lived alone in the deep forest for as long as anyone could remember. "Mountain speaks," he said without preamble. "Says storm coming." "Weather storm?" Sarah asked. Joe's dark eyes moved between her and Jacob. "All kinds of storms." He crossed to Sarah and placed a small leather pouch in her hands. "Herbs. For strength. Baby comes soon. You need power." "Thank you," Sarah said. Joe turned to Jacob. "You trying to walk again?" It was not a question. Jacob nodded slowly. "Good. But remember, mountain doesn't judge how you climb, only that you reach the top." "How did you know?" Sarah asked. Joe smiled, revealing gaps where teeth had been. "Forest talks. Trees remember when you were strong. They don't care about chair. They care about heart." He left as quietly as he had arrived, disappearing into the gathering dusk. That night, Jacob tried again. With Sarah watching, he lowered himself to the floor and spent 30 minutes working his legs. The right one was definitely responding. He could bend the knee, flex the foot, even lift it a few inches off the ground. The left was weaker, but showed flickers of movement. Progress. Slow, painful, but real. Over the next week, Jacob worked his legs every morning before dawn. Sarah watched his face during these sessions. The concentration, the frustration, the tiny victories when a muscle obeyed or a joint bent further than before. The basket orders continued. Money accumulated in their strongbox. They were going to make it. They were going to pay Hardwick and keep the land. Then Silas Hardwick returned. He brought 4 men this time, all armed. They rode up the mountain trail in the late afternoon, their horses' hooves loud on the rocky path. Jacob and Sarah were working in the yard when they arrived. Caleb was in town buying supplies. "Heard you're making good money, Bear," Hardwick called from his saddle. "Real good money. Thought I'd collect early." "We have 2 months left on the contract," Jacob said. Hardwick dismounted, his considerable weight making the horse snort with relief. He pulled a paper from his coat. "Contract says I can call the debt if circumstances change materially." His smile was oily. "You got married. You started a business. I'd say circumstances changed." Sarah stepped forward. "That clause requires proof of inability to pay. We're current on our timeline." Hardwick's eyes narrowed. "You read legal language?" "I read everything." "Well, ain't you educated?" Hardwick's voice dripped contempt. "Tell you what, though, Judge Morrison is a friend of mine, and he'll see things my way when I explain how a cripple and a pregnant woman can't possibly manage a working timber claim." "This isn't a timber claim anymore," Jacob said. "It's a home and a workshop. Different use entirely." Hardwick's face reddened. "Don't lawyer at me, boy. I've got 4 witnesses here that'll swear you're operating a commercial enterprise on residential land. That's breach of zoning. I can get this place condemned." He stepped closer to Sarah. "Storm's coming, girl. Real storm. Be a shame if this cabin had trouble. If something happened to your workshop. Accidents occur in bad weather." The threat was unmistakable. Sarah felt rage building in her chest, hot and dangerous. "Get off our land," she said quietly. "Or what? You'll have your cripple husband fight me?" Jacob's hands gripped his wheelchair arms so hard the wood creaked. But he stayed seated, stayed calm. "Marshal Pritchard will hear about this threat." Hardwick laughed. "Cole Pritchard? He's on my payroll, sweetheart. Everyone is." He remounted his horse. 2 months. Then I take everything. And if you try to fight me, you'll learn real quick who owns this town." The riders left, their laughter floating back through the trees. Sarah turned to Jacob. Her hands were shaking with fury and fear. "We need help. Real help. We can't fight him alone." Jacob nodded slowly. "Tomorrow, we go to town. We talk to everyone he's threatened. Because I guarantee we're not the only ones." That night, Sarah lay in bed, listening to Jacob work his legs in the room below. She heard his grunts of effort, his gasps of pain. She placed her hand on her swollen belly and felt the baby's strong kicks. 2 fights at once. The fight for their land, and the fight for Jacob's legs. She did not know if they could win either battle, but she knew one thing with absolute certainty. They would not surrender without trying. Outside, the wind began to pick up. In the distance, thunder rumbled. Cherokee Joe's storm was coming. All kinds of storms. The town meeting happened 3 days later in the small church where Jacob and Sarah had married. Pastor Ezra Whitfield stood at the front, his weathered face grave as he looked out at the 40 souls gathered in the pews. The October rain drummed steadily on the roof, a constant reminder of the weather that had been building for weeks. Sarah sat in the front row, her pregnant belly making the wooden pew uncomfortable. Jacob was beside her in his wheelchair, his massive shoulders tense. Around them sat the people of Timber Ridge, farmers and shopkeepers, widows and young families, all of them weathered by hard mountain living, all of them waiting. Marshal Cole Pritchard stood near the door, his hand resting on his gun belt. He was 45 years old, with steel-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. He had been law in these mountains for 20 years. "Folks asked for this meeting," Pastor Ezra began, "so let's hear what needs saying." Sarah stood, placing one hand on the pew back for balance. Her voice carried clearly through the small space. "Silas Hardwick wants my husband's land, not because of the debt, because of the timber. Old-growth oak and walnut worth thousands of dollars." She paused, looking around the room. "He threatened us, said accidents happen in storms, said he owns the judge and the marshal." Several people shifted uncomfortably. Marshal Pritchard's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. "I want to know something," Sarah continued. "Who else here owes Hardwick money?" The silence stretched. Then, slowly, hands began to rise. Widow Ruth raised hers first, then Henderson, the farmer whose land bordered the McKennas, then more, one after another, until 15 hands were in the air. 15 families, a third of everyone present. "He loaned me money to rebuild my barn after the fire," Henderson said quietly, "then raised the interest rate twice. Now I owe more than the original loan." "He bought my husband's equipment after he died," Widow Ruth added. "Paid half what it was worth, said, 'Take it or get nothing.'" More stories spilled out. Loans called early. Interest rates changed without notice. Threats of legal action. Witnesses who disappeared before trials. The picture that emerged was clear. Silas Hardwick had been systematically taking over Timber Ridge for years, one family at a time, one debt at a time. Marshal Pritchard finally spoke. "I've suspected for years. But Hardwick's clever, never leaves evidence. His men do the dirty work and keep their mouths shut." "So what do we do?" Henderson asked. "We can't fight him in court. He owns the judge." "We fight him together," Jacob said. Every head turned toward him. It was the first time he had spoken. His voice was low, but it carried power. "Alone, we're nothing to him. Together, we're the whole town. We document everything, every threat, every illegal contract clause, every witness to his men's actions. We build a case so solid, even a corrupt judge can't ignore it." "And if that doesn't work," someone called from the back, "then we make sure everyone knows what he's doing. We send word to Knoxville, to the territorial governor. We make enough noise that people with real power have to pay attention." Widow Ruth stood. "I'll testify about his threats. Written statement, signed and witnessed." "Me too," Henderson said. "And me." One by one, voices joined. The fear in the room was transforming into something else, something harder, determination. Pastor Ezra raised his hands. "Alone, we're branches. Together, we're the forest." And Hardwick's about to learn that this forest doesn't break easy. The meeting ended with plans made, documents to be gathered, testimonies to be written, a delegation to ride to Knoxville with their case. As people filed out into the rain, Marshal Pritchard approached Jacob and Sarah. "I'll keep watch on your place. But you should know, Hardwick's getting desperate. Desperate men do stupid things." "We'll be ready," Jacob said. That night, back at the cabin, Sarah sat by the fire while Jacob worked at his carving. The basket orders were almost complete. They were 3 days from having enough money to pay off Hardwick entirely. But money might not be enough anymore. Not if Hardwick decided to take what he wanted, by force. "You should rest," Jacob said, noticing Sarah rubbing her lower back. "Can't. Baby won't let me get comfortable." "How long?" "Dr. Brennan says 2 weeks, maybe 3. Jacob set down his carving tools. "Sarah, if something happens, if Hardwick comes here when I'm not ready to fight—" She cut him off. "You're ready now. You've always been ready. The chair doesn't change that." His eyes met hers across the firelight. In the 6 weeks since their marriage, something had shifted between them. It was not love, not yet, but it was trust and respect, and a partnership forged in crisis. "I've been trying," he said quietly. "Every morning. My right leg is getting stronger. I can push myself up now, hold my weight for almost a minute." "That's wonderful. But it's not enough. Not to stand and fight. Not to protect you if men come with guns." Sarah leaned forward. "Listen to me. Protection doesn't mean fighting. It means being smart. And you're the smartest man I know." Before Jacob could respond, Caleb burst through the door. His face was pale, rain streaming from his hair. "Riders," he gasped, "coming up the trail. At least 6 of them." Jacob moved fast. He wheeled to the window and peered through the shutters. In the fading light, he could see mounted men approaching. Leading them was Silas Hardwick's massive form. "Get Sarah to the loft," Jacob told Caleb. "Now." "I'm not hiding," Sarah protested. "You're 8 months pregnant. You're hiding." Jacob's voice left no room for argument. Caleb helped Sarah up the ladder to the loft. Below, Jacob positioned his wheelchair near the door. He pulled the hunting knife from his belt and laid it across his lap. Not to use, but to show he was not defenseless. The riders stopped outside. Jacob heard Hardwick's voice, loud and mocking. "McKenna, come out here, boy." Jacob opened the door but did not cross the threshold. The rain had intensified, turning the yard to mud. "This is private property, Hardwick. State your business, or leave." Hardwick dismounted with surprising speed for a man his size. "My business is repossession. You're in breach of contract. I'm claiming this land effective immediately. We're current on all payments. Your contract specified residential use only. You're running a commercial workshop. That's breach of terms." Jacob's hands tightened on his wheels. "That clause requires proof of commercial income exceeding residential use by 50%. We're not there." "Don't lawyer at me, cripple." Hardwick pulled a paper from his coat. "I got an order here from Judge Morrison. Effective tomorrow morning, this property transfers to me, pending adjudication of contract disputes." "Let me see that." Jacob reached for the paper, but Hardwick pulled it back. "You'll see it when the sheriff serves you proper. I'm just here as a courtesy, to offer you a deal." "What deal?" "Sign over the property tonight. Peaceful-like. I'll forgive the debt and give you $1,000 to relocate. Your wife and boy, too. Clean start somewhere else." The offer was almost tempting. $1,000 was real money, enough to start over, enough to avoid the fight that was coming. But it would mean losing the home Jacob had built with his own hands, losing the workshop where he had found purpose again, losing everything he had created from the ashes of his old life. "No deal," Jacob said. Hardwick's face darkened. "You're making a mistake, boy. Big storm coming. Flooding expected. Lots of things can happen in a flood. Property gets damaged. People get hurt. Accidents happen. That's a threat. That's a warning." Hardwick remounted his horse. "You got until morning to reconsider. After that, we do this the hard way." The riders left, disappearing into the rain and gathering darkness. Sarah climbed down from the loft, moving carefully. He's going to come back. I know. What do we do? Jacob wheeled to the cabinet where he kept his rifle. We get ready, and we get word to Marshal Pritchard. Caleb was already moving toward the door. I'll ride to town. Be back in 2 hours. Be careful. And boy? Caleb turned. Ride hard. We don't have much time. After Caleb left, Sarah helped Jacob check their defenses. The cabin was solid, built to withstand mountain winters. The doors were thick oak with iron reinforcements. The windows had shutters that could be barred from inside. But Jacob knew that determined men with fire could burn them out, or wait for them to run out of food and water. A siege was not something they could win, unless help arrived first. The rain intensified through the night. By morning, the small creek that ran past their property had swollen to twice its normal size. The sky was dark gray, heavy with more rain to come. Caleb returned at dawn with news. Marshal Pritchard is gathering men. 20 volunteers said they'd ride up here if trouble starts. But Hardwick's got the legal paper. Pritchard can't stop him from serving it. When will he come? Noon. Pritchard said Hardwick will bring the sheriff and serve you official, then give you till sunset to vacate. 6 hours, Sarah said. 6 hours to pack our lives and leave. Jacob's face was stone. We're not leaving. What choice do we have? Before he could answer, there was a knock at the door. Sarah opened it to find Dr. Thomas Brennan standing in the rain. The 58-year-old physician looked exhausted. Doc, what brings you up here in this weather? Brennan stepped inside, water pooling around his boots. Got something you need to hear, about Hardwick's legal paper. He pulled a damp envelope from his coat. My cousin works at the courthouse in Knoxville. I asked him to check Hardwick's claim about Judge Morrison's order. And? There is no order. Judge Morrison has been dead for 3 weeks. Heart failure. Hardwick's paper is a forgery. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. You're certain? Jacob asked. Positive. My cousin sent this copy of the death certificate. Morrison died October 15th. Hardwick's order is dated 3 days ago. That's fraud, Sarah breathed. Criminal fraud. More than that, Brennan said. Impersonating a dead judge to seize property? That's a territorial offense. Federal marshals would have jurisdiction. Jacob looked at Sarah. We need to get this to Marshal Pritchard before Hardwick arrives. Too late, Caleb said from the window. He's already here. Outside, at least a dozen riders were approaching through the rain. Leading them was Hardwick, his bulk unmistakable. Beside him rode a man wearing a sheriff's star. Everyone stay calm, Jacob said. Let me handle this. The riders stopped in the yard. Hardwick dismounted along with the sheriff, a thin man with a nervous manner. Jacob McKenna, the sheriff called. I have an order here for repossession of this property, pending settlement of contractual disputes. May I see the order? The sheriff handed over a rain-dampened document. Jacob read it carefully, noting the signature at the bottom. Judge Morrison's name in flowing script. This order was signed by Judge Morrison? That's right. When? 4 days ago, October 23rd. Jacob looked up at Hardwick. Funny thing about that. Judge Morrison died on October 15th, 8 days before he supposedly signed this paper. The sheriff's face went pale. What? Dr. Brennan stepped forward, holding up the death certificate. Official record from Knoxville Courthouse. Judge Morrison has been dead for 3 weeks. The sheriff snatched the certificate, his hands shaking as he read it. His eyes moved from the paper to Hardwick and back again. Silas, what is this? Hardwick's face had gone purple with rage. "That's a forgery. They're trying to trick you." Marshal Cole Pritchard chose that moment to arrive, leading a group of 20 armed men from town. His horse splashed through the swollen creek, water spraying. "No forgery, Silas," Pritchard called. "I rode to Knoxville myself this morning, confirmed the judge's death with my own eyes, saw his grave, fresh dirt and all." He dismounted and walked directly to Hardwick. "Which means this order is fake. Which means you just committed fraud against a federal officer." He gestured to the sheriff. "That's territorial prison, Silas. 5 to 10 years. Hardwick's eyes darted around, looking for escape. His men, seeing the 20 townspeople arrayed against them, were already backing their horses away. "I didn't know," Hardwick sputtered. "My lawyer must have made a mistake." "Your lawyer?" Pritchard smiled coldly. "You don't have a lawyer, Silas. Everyone knows you write your own papers." He pulled out manacles. "Silas Hardwick, you're under arrest for fraud, forgery, and conspiracy to seize property through false documents." As Pritchard secured the cuffs, Henderson stepped forward from the group of townspeople. "While you're arresting him, Marshal, you should know he tried to burn my barn last month. I got witnesses. His men were seen leaving right before the fire started. And he's been threatening people for years," Widow Ruth added. "I got a list of names. Folks will testify." One by one, the townspeople spoke up. Years of intimidation and threats spilled out. Hardwick's empire of fear collapsed in minutes. "Looks like you'll be facing multiple charges," Pritchard said. "Might be 10 to 20 years instead of 5 to 10. Hardwick's face crumpled. He looked at Jacob, and for a moment, something like pleading showed in his eyes. "I needed that timber. I'm in debt myself. Chicago investors. If I don't deliver, they'll kill me." "Should have thought of that before you started threatening pregnant women and crippled men," Jacob said quietly. As Pritchard led Hardwick away, the townspeople erupted in cheers. Henderson clapped Jacob on the shoulder. Sarah found herself embraced by Widow Ruth. But the celebration was cut short by a shout from one of the men watching the creek. "Water's rising! Fast!" Everyone turned to look. The creek, already swollen, was climbing its banks with alarming speed. As they watched, it spilled over and began spreading across the lower pasture. Cherokee Joe had been right. The storm was here, and it was going to be worse than anyone imagined. The rain that had been falling for 3 days became something else entirely. It came down in sheets, turning the world gray and formless. The creek that ran past Jacob's cabin transformed from a gentle stream into a churning brown torrent within an hour. Trees that had stood for 100 years bent under the weight of water. The mountains themselves seemed to weep. Marshal Pritchard secured Hardwick to a tree near the cabin, unwilling to risk the flooded trail back to town. The 20 townspeople who had ridden up to support Jacob now found themselves trapped on the high ground around his property. "We need to get word to the families below," Henderson shouted over the roar of water. "My place is right on the creek bank. My wife and kids are there alone." "Mine too," another man called. "The Kowalski farm. They'll be cut off." Jacob wheeled to the edge of his porch, studying the swollen waterway. His mind, trained by years of reading the mountains, saw what others missed. The water was not just rising, it was moving wrong, too fast, too angry. "Something's feeding this upstream," he said. "More than rain." "What do you mean?" Pritchard asked. Jacob pointed toward the higher peaks. "There's an earthen dam up at Copper Creek, built 20 years ago to create a mill pond. If this rain has saturated that dam wall..." He did not need to finish. Everyone understood. If the dam broke, a wall of water would come down the valley. Everything in its path would be destroyed. "How long do we have?" Sarah asked from the doorway. "If the dam holds?" "Days." "If it fails?" Jacob shook his head. "Minutes after we hear it break." "Then we need to get everyone to high ground now," Pritchard said. "How many families are in the valley?" Jacob closed his eyes, picturing the scattered homesteads, the Bennett place, Kowalski's, the Hendersons, old widow Patterson, the schoolhouse where teacher Mary lived with her 6 boarding students. At least 40 people, maybe more. Can we reach them all? Not on horseback. Water's too high and moving too fast. Jacob's mind was already working the problem the way he had worked logging challenges for years, breaking impossible tasks into possible pieces. We need rope lines, tree to tree, like a horizontal ladder. People can pull themselves across the current using the ropes.
"Who's going to string those lines?" Henderson asked. "In this weather?" Jacob looked at his hands, the same hands that had pulled timber from mountainsides, the same hands that carved beauty from wood, the same hands that had learned to move his body without legs. "I am." The silence that followed was louder than the storm. "Jacob, you can't," Sarah said quietly. "I can." His voice was iron. "I've got the strength in my arms to pull myself along rope lines. And I know every tree and rock formation in this valley. I can navigate it blind." "But you can't walk. If something goes wrong." "Then I improvise, like I've done every day for 6 months." He wheeled back into the cabin. From a storage chest, he pulled out the equipment of his old life. Coils of climbing rope, carabiners and pulleys, a harness designed for men working in trees. "Caleb," he called, "gather every bit of rope we have, from the workshop too, and those young men who've been helping with the baskets. I need them." Within minutes, Jacob had assembled a crew. 4 young men, strong and willing. Caleb to coordinate. Henderson, who knew the valley almost as well as Jacob did. "Here's how we do this," Jacob said, spreading a crude map on the floor. He had drawn it from memory, marking every cabin and landmark. "We start here. Run a line to the big oak by Bennett's place. From there to the cottonwood near the Kowalskis. Then across to high ground near the church." "It's half a mile of rope line," Henderson protested, "through flooded forest." "Then we better get started." Jacob transferred himself from wheelchair to the makeshift raft he designed on the spot. 4 logs lashed together with crossbeams. In the center, a platform just large enough for him to sit, handles on each side for the other men to grip. The theory was simple. The execution was madness. They launched at the creek's edge. The current grabbed them immediately, trying to sweep them downstream. But Jacob had rigged guide ropes to trees on both banks. The men held tight, pulling the raft across the flow inch by inch. Jacob's upper body did the work his legs could not. Hand over hand on the ropes, arms that had been strengthened by months of wheelchair use, now pulling with the force of a man who refused to drown. The Bennett place came into view through the rain. The family house stood on a slight rise, water already lapping at the porch steps. Jacob could see faces in the window. 4 children and their parents, terrified. "Tie off here," Jacob commanded. The men secured the raft to a massive oak tree. Jacob pulled himself up using the branches, moving like a massive bear. Without legs to help, every movement required 3 times the effort. But he had been climbing trees since he was 5 years old. His body remembered. He reached a thick branch 15 feet up and secured the rope. Then, hand over hand, he pulled himself back down. The Bennett family emerged onto their porch. Water was now touching the bottom step. "We're here to get you out," Jacob called. "Children first." It took 30 minutes to ferry the Bennett family across the flooded zone. The smallest child, barely 4 years old, cried the entire way.
But Jacob held him secure, whispering calm words the boy probably could not hear over the storm. One family safe, at least 9 more to go. They worked through the morning and into the afternoon. The Kowalski family, Widow Patterson, who insisted on bringing her dead husband's Bible, Teacher Mary and her 6 students, the youngest only 7. Each rescue took precious time. Each crossing of the flood was a battle against current and cold and fatigue. Jacob never stopped, even when his hands bled from rope burns, even when his arms shook with exhaustion, even when Sarah begged him through tears to rest. "There are still people out there," he said simply. "We go until they're safe." By mid-afternoon they had saved 32 people. Everyone was accounted for except one family, the Drummonds, a husband, wife, and infant, living in the valley's lowest point. The last report had them trapped on their roof, water rising fast. "I'm going," Jacob said, already moving back to the raft. Sarah grabbed his arm. "Jacob, you've been out there for 6 hours. You're exhausted. Let someone else go." There is no one else who knows how to reach their place. The approach is all deadfall and rapids. I've logged that section. I know where the rocks are. "Then I'm coming with you." Jacob stared at her. "You're 8 months pregnant. And I can paddle, and I can hold the rope. And those people have a baby. They're more scared than we are. They need to see another woman's face, someone who understands." The logic was unassailable. Jacob nodded slowly. "Caleb will paddle stern. You stay in the middle. Hold the guide rope and keep us on line." The journey to the Drummond place was the worst yet. The water had risen another foot, and the current was vicious. Twice the raft nearly capsized. Once a submerged log struck them hard enough to crack one of the support beams. But Jacob's knowledge of the terrain saved them. Left here to avoid the rock shelf, right to catch the eddy behind the fallen cottonwood, straight through the rapids where the current was actually most stable. They reached the Drummond house to find the family on the roof, as reported. But the water was higher than expected. Another 2 feet and they would be swept away. The rescue was delicate work, getting a terrified woman and a screaming infant down from a slippery roof into a floating raft, while the current tried to tear everything apart. Sarah was the key. She climbed halfway up the roof's slope, her pregnant belly making balance precarious. But her voice was steady and calm. "I've got you. Hand me the baby. I won't let go, I promise." The trust in that moment was absolute. The Drummond woman handed her infant to a stranger in the middle of a flood. And Sarah, 8 months pregnant and barely able to keep her own balance, held that child as if it were her own. They made it back to the main rope line just as the light began to fail. 40 people now safe on the high ground around Jacob's cabin. Every family in the valley accounted for. "That's everyone," Henderson said, his voice hoarse with exhaustion and relief. Jacob nodded, too tired to speak. His arms hung limp at his sides. His hands were torn and bleeding. But everyone was safe. That was when they heard it, a sound like distant thunder, but wrong, too low, too continuous, growing louder. Cherokee Joe appeared at the edge of the clearing, as if summoned by the noise itself. The old Cherokee's face was grave. "Dam broke," he said simply. "Wall of water comin', 20 feet high, maybe 15 minutes. 15 minutes to get 40 people higher, to a place that could survive what was coming." Jacob looked around. His cabin was the highest point on his property, built on bedrock. But it was not high enough, not for a 20-foot wall of water.
Then his eyes found it. Through the rain and failing light, he saw the old fire tower. It stood a quarter-mile away, built by the Forest Service in 1875. 35 feet of timber frame, topped by a small platform. Jacob had used it for years during logging operations. It was solid, and it was high enough. "The tower," he said. "Everyone to the fire tower, now!" The evacuation was chaos and coordination in equal measure. The strong helping the weak, the young carrying the old. 40 people moving through darkening forest toward a structure that might or might not save them. Jacob reached the base of the tower last. He had stayed behind to make sure everyone else made it. Now he looked up at the ladder. 35 rungs, 35 feet. Impossible for a man who could barely feel his legs. Caleb appeared beside him. "I'll get everyone up. You coordinate from here." "No," Jacob's voice was absolute. "I need to be up top. It's the only place with a clear view of the whole valley. When that water hits, I need to see who needs help." "Uncle Jacob, you can't climb that." "Watch me." The crowd that had gathered at the tower's base fell silent as Jacob transferred from his wheelchair to the bottom rung of the ladder. He looked up at the distance he had to cover and thought about everything that had brought him to this moment. The tree that had fallen on him. The choice to stop fighting. The marriage to Sarah that had taught him to fight again. The town that now depended on him. Some things matter more than fear. He pulled himself up to the first rung, then the second. His arms did all the work. His legs hung useless at first. Dead weight that made every pull twice as hard. Third rung, fourth. Below him, 40 people watched in absolute silence. The only sounds were the rain and Jacob's breathing and the distant roar of approaching water. Fifth rung. Sixth. His right leg twitched, just a small flexing of the muscle. But it pushed, just a fraction, just enough to take some of the weight off his arms. Seventh rung. Eighth. Ninth. He was 10 feet off the ground now, high enough that a fall would hurt, maybe cripple him further, but not high enough to matter. His arms screamed. Muscles that had pulled him through 6 months of wheelchair existence now asked to do the impossible. 10th rung. 11th. 12th. Halfway. 18 more to go. Sweat poured down his face despite the cold rain. His breath came in gasps. His right leg was definitely helping now, pushing with maybe a third of its old strength. His left leg still hung limp. 13, 14, 15. The climb became a rhythm now. Pull, push, breathe. His right leg was firing more consistently, taking some weight. Below, he could hear people praying. Pastor Ezra's voice leading them. "Lord, lift him up. Give him strength." 16, 17. His right hand slipped. For one heart-stopping moment, he hung by his left arm alone. 40 people gasped as one. But Jacob's grip held. He found the rung again and kept climbing. 18, 19, 20. 20 feet up. Only 15 more. The platform was close enough to see details now. The weathered boards, the railing around the edge. His entire body screamed for rest, but there was no rest. Only up. 21, 23, 25. Both legs were responding now. Not much, not enough to walk, but enough to push, enough to help bear his weight for moments at a time. 10 feet to go. Jacob's vision narrowed to just the next rung,
then the next, then the next. 26, 27, 28. His left leg cramped. Pain shot through the wasted muscle like lightning. Jacob bit down on a scream and kept climbing. 29th, 30th, 5 feet, 5 more impossible feet. 31st, 32nd. He could reach out and touch the platform now, but 3 rungs remained. 33rd. His arms gave out. Not metaphorically, actually failed. The muscles simply stopped responding. Jacob hung there, 3 feet from safety, and felt his grip beginning to slip. Then Sarah's voice cut through everything. "Jacob McKenna, you climb those last 2 rungs. Our child needs to meet her father standing." Something in her words bypassed exhaustion and pain and impossibility. Jacob's hands found strength they did not have. His right leg pushed with force it should not possess. 34th rung, 1 more. 35th. Jacob pulled himself onto the platform and collapsed. His chest heaved. His arms would not move. But he was up. From below, 40 voices erupted in cheers and sobs. Jacob lay on his back, staring at the gray sky, and felt tears mix with rain on his face. Then he heard the roar intensify. The dam water was close. Jacob forced himself to sit up, to grip the platform railing, to look out over the valley he had sworn to protect. What he saw took his breath away. A wall of brown water 20 feet high was sweeping down the valley. Trees snapped like kindling before it. Buildings dissolved like paper. Everything in its path simply ceased to exist. Jacob watched it come and called down coordinates to the people gathered below. "Henderson cabin directly in the path. Is everyone accounted for?" "All here," Henderson called back. "Kowalski barn in the flood zone. Livestock?" "Got them out this morning," Kowalski confirmed. One by one, Jacob verified that every person, every family, every soul was safe on high ground or in the tower itself. The water hit like the wrath of God. It roared past the tower's base with enough force to shake the entire structure. Debris crashed against the support posts. Whole trees tumbled past. The remains of someone's home swept by in pieces. But the tower held, and the people held. And when the water finally receded hours later, leaving behind a landscape of mud and destruction, every single person was alive. Jacob descended the ladder in darkness. His legs were useless again. Whatever strength they had found was exhausted, but it did not matter. At the bottom, Sarah waited. Her face was streaked with tears. Her hand rested on her belly. "You did it," she whispered. "You saved them all." "We did it," Jacob corrected. "All of us." Then Sarah gasped, not in fear, in surprise. She grabbed Jacob's hand and pressed it to her swollen belly. "The baby. Jacob, the baby's coming." "Of course it is," Jacob said. And despite everything, he smiled. "Of course our child decides to be born right now." Dr. Brennan pushed through the crowd. "How far apart are the contractions?" Sarah breathed through another wave of pain. 5 minutes, maybe less." Around them, the people of Timber Ridge formed a circle, creating privacy and shelter with their own bodies, protecting the woman who had risked her life to help them, honoring the man who had climbed impossible heights to save them. And at the base of a fire tower, in the middle of a disaster, as the rain finally began to ease, Sarah McKenna prepared to bring new life into a world that had just been reborn by water. The makeshift birthing room was the platform at the top of the fire tower.
Getting Sarah up there required ingenuity. The men rigged a sling from blankets and ropes, creating a seat that could be pulled from above, while men below steadied the lines. Widow Ruth and 2 other women climbed alongside, guiding and reassuring. Dr. Brennan went up first to prepare. It took 20 careful minutes, but they lifted Sarah to the platform safely.
Below, Jacob watched every foot of her ascent, his hands gripping his wheelchair arms until his knuckles went white. Below, the men kept watch on the receding floodwaters and maintained the fires that provided the only light in the darkness. Jacob sat at the tower's base, his exhausted body unable to make the climb again. His arms, which had pulled him up 35 rungs just hours before, now hung useless at his sides. But his mind was sharp, listening to every sound from above. Sarah's labor progressed fast. Too fast, according to Dr. Brennan's shouted updates. The stress of the day, the physical exertion, the terror of the flood, all of it had triggered the baby's arrival ahead of schedule. Through the wooden planks of the tower platform, Jacob could hear Sarah's breathing, controlled at first, then ragged, then punctuated by cries she could not contain. He had climbed mountains and felled the tallest trees in Tennessee. He had survived an accident that should have killed him, and learned to live in a body that no longer obeyed. But sitting helpless while his wife suffered 35 feet above him was the hardest thing he had ever endured. "How is she?" he called up for the 10th time. "Strong," Dr. Brennan shouted back. "The baby's coming, not long now." Around Jacob, the 40 people they had saved that day sat in huddled groups, families holding each other, children sleeping despite the cold and wet. Old Widow Patterson prayed quietly, her dead husband's Bible open on her lap. Marshal Pritchard approached, a steaming cup in his hands. "Coffee, donated by someone's emergency supplies. Drink this. You look like death." "Feel worse than I look." Pritchard settled beside him. "What you did today, climbing that tower, coordinating the rescues. I've been lawman for 20 years, and I never saw anything braver." Jacob shook his head. It wasn't bravery. It was necessity. Those people needed help. "Same thing in my experience." Pritchard sipped his own coffee. "You know what's interesting? 6 months ago, you were the strongest man in these mountains, could outwork anyone. Then you got hurt, and everyone figured you were done." Jacob's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. "But you're stronger now than you ever were. Not in body, in here." Pritchard tapped his chest. "That's the strength that matters. The kind that doesn't quit when things get hard." Before Jacob could respond, a new sound came from above. A baby's cry, thin and angry and absolutely beautiful. "It's a girl!" Widow Ruth shouted down. "Healthy lungs and all her fingers and toes." Jacob's eyes closed. Relief and joy and exhaustion washed over him in equal measure. A girl. A daughter. Not his blood, but his in every way that mattered. "Can I come up?" he called. "Few minutes," Dr. Brennan replied. "Let us get mother and baby settled." Those few minutes felt like hours. Finally, Widow Ruth's face appeared at the tower's edge. "Come on up, Jacob McKenna. Your wife wants you." The second climb was harder than the first. Jacob's arms had nothing left to give. But he had climbed this tower once today when it was impossible. He could climb it again. This time, hands helped him. Young men from the town climbed alongside, supporting his weight when his grip faltered, pushing from below when his strength gave out. It took 15 minutes to cover 35 feet, but he made it. At the top, Sarah lay wrapped in blankets on the wooden platform. Her face was pale and drawn with exhaustion.
Her hair was plastered to her forehead with sweat, but her eyes were bright as she held a tiny bundle against her chest. "Jacob," she whispered, "meet your daughter." Jacob pulled himself closer, his useless legs dragging behind him. When he reached Sarah's side, she carefully placed the baby in his massive, scarred hands. The child was impossibly small. Her face was red and wrinkled. Her eyes were closed. One tiny fist waved in the air, as if protesting the indignity of being born during a disaster. "She's perfect," Jacob said, his voice breaking. "We're calling her Hope." Sarah's hand found his. Hope Elizabeth McKenna, because she was born when everything seemed lost, and reminded us why we keep fighting. Jacob looked from the baby to Sarah and back again. His family, built from tragedy and necessity and choices neither of them would have made if life had been kinder, but family nonetheless. "Hope Elizabeth McKenna," he repeated. He touched the baby's tiny hand, and her fingers closed around one of his calloused digits. The trust in that grip broke something open in his chest. A man who could not walk would still teach this child to stand. A man who had lost everything would give this child a foundation. The night passed slowly. Dr. Brennan checked on Sarah and the baby regularly. Both were healthy, despite the circumstances. As dawn approached, the rain finally stopped. The floodwaters continued to recede, revealing the devastation below. Jacob made the descent at first light, assisted again by willing hands. At the bottom, he transferred back to his wheelchair and rolled to the edge of the clearing. What he saw stole his breath. The valley was gone. Not damaged, gone. Every building below the high ground line had been swept away. Trees were uprooted. Entire sections of forest had vanished. The landscape had been scoured clean by water and left barren as a desert. But his cabin stood. Perched on its foundation of solid bedrock, built high by a man who understood mountains, the cabin had survived. Water had reached the porch, but not entered the house. The workshop was intact. Even the wood pile Jacob had stacked so carefully remained mostly in place. He had built something that lasted, something that protected, and in the process, he had become something more than the man he used to be. Henderson approached, his face grim. "My place is gone." Saw pieces of it float by during the night. Everything we owned. 20 years of work, just gone. "I'm sorry," Jacob said. "Don't be." Henderson gripped Jacob's shoulder. "My family is alive because of you. We can rebuild a house. Can't rebuild my children." One by one, people came to assess the damage. Every home in the valley was destroyed. Months or years of work erased in a single night. But not one person had died. Not one child was lost. Not one family was incomplete. And slowly, through grief and exhaustion, something else emerged. Determination. The people of Timber Ridge were mountain folk. They knew how to endure. They knew how to rebuild. And they knew they would do it together. By mid-morning, Marshal Pritchard made a decision. "We're going to Jacob's cabin. It's the only structure left standing. We'll shelter there until we can get word to Knoxville for supplies." The migration up the mountain trail took most of the day. 40 people, exhausted and traumatized, helping each other climb. The young carrying the old, the strong supporting the weak. A community bound by shared survival. Jacob's cabin, designed for a man in a wheelchair and his small family, suddenly housed dozens. People slept on the floor, in the loft, even in the workshop. Sarah and the baby were given the bedroom. Everyone else made do. Food was pooled. The Bennetts had managed to save some smoked meat. The Kowalskis had flour in waterproof tins. Widow Ruth contributed preserves she had stored in high ground. Combined with game that the young men hunted and water from Jacob's well, they had enough to survive. 3 days after the flood, as the community began to establish routines and make plans, a rider arrived from town. Most of Timber Ridge had survived. The town proper was on high ground and had been spared the worst. But Silas Hardwick's lumber mill, built in the lowest part of the valley for easy water access, had been completely destroyed. Every piece of equipment, every pile of cut timber, everything. Hardwick had been ruined by the same flood he had inadvertently predicted. The rider brought something else, an official letter bearing the seal of the territorial governor. Jacob opened it with shaking hands and read aloud. To Jacob McKenna, reports have reached Knoxville of your actions during the flood of October 1887. Your coordination of rescue efforts and your personal heroism in saving 43 citizens have been noted. Effective immediately, you are appointed Regional Emergency Coordinator for the Smoky Mountain District. Annual salary of $400 plus expenses. Your first duty is to implement an early warning system for flood prevention across the entire mountain region. $400. More money than Jacob had made in his best year as a logger.
And a position of real authority, real responsibility. They want you to be official, Henderson said with a grin. Make it so you can't say no next time there's trouble. Jacob looked at Sarah, who had emerged from the bedroom with Hope sleeping in her arms. She smiled and nodded. Tell them I accept, Jacob said. That night, after everyone else was asleep and the cabin was full of the sounds of 40 people breathing, Sarah found Jacob sitting on the porch. Hope was cradled in his arms, tiny and perfect against his massive chest. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, settling beside him carefully. "Everything. Nothing." Jacob's voice was soft so as not to wake the baby. 6 months ago, I was the strongest man in these mountains. Then, I was the weakest. Now I don't know what I am. You're the man who climbed a tower to save his town. The man who built a home that survived when everything else fell. The man who made us a family. Sarah leaned her head on his shoulder. That's what you are. My legs are still broken, Sarah. I might walk someday, or I might not. That doesn't change. No, she agreed. But you don't need to walk to stand for something. You proved that. They sat in silence, watching the stars emerge as the clouds finally cleared. Below them, the devastated valley lay dark and empty. But around them, in the cabin Jacob had built, life continued. Children dreamed. Families healed. Hope, in all its forms, persisted. A week after the flood, as people began the work of rebuilding, another visitor arrived. Cherokee Joe emerged from the forest as if he had always been there. He approached Jacob's porch and studied the man in the wheelchair with ancient eyes. "Mountain gave you back your legs," Joe said, "but you gave Mountain your heart first." "I don't understand." Joe smiled. "Strong man breaks under weight. Wise man learns to carry it different. You learned." He handed Jacob a small, carved figure, a bear standing on its hind legs, carved from dark wood. But this bear had one paw raised not in threat, but in benediction. "You are guardian now, not because you stand, because you refuse to fall." Joe disappeared back into the forest, leaving Jacob holding the carving and pondering words he would not fully understand for years.
2 months later, winter had settled over the mountains, and the work of rebuilding had begun in earnest. Jacob's cabin remained the center of operations. From there, he coordinated reconstruction efforts across the entire valley. His organizational skills, honed by years of managing logging crews, proved invaluable. His knowledge of the terrain guided decisions about where to rebuild and how high. The early warning system he designed was elegant in its simplicity. Signal bells at key points throughout the mountains. Observers posted during rainy seasons. Clear protocols for evacuation. It was not perfect, but it would save lives.
Jacob's workshop had expanded. He now employed 6 men full-time, teaching them the woodworking skills he had mastered. The business thrived. Orders came from as far away as Nashville and Atlanta for the furniture and carvings that bore the McKenna mark. Sarah had taken over the financial records not just for their household, but for the entire reconstruction effort. Her organizational skills and head for numbers made her indispensable. She was, in all but name, the treasurer of Timber Ridge's recovery. Hope grew fat and happy, doted on by an entire community that saw her as a symbol of survival. The baby who had been born during the flood. The child who represented the future they were all building together. And Jacob's legs? They had continued to improve, slowly, inconsistently, but undeniably. He could stand now, for short periods, leaning on a cane he had carved himself. He could take steps, awkward and painful, but real. His right leg had regained perhaps 60% of its function. His left was weaker, but no longer completely useless. He still used the wheelchair most of the time. It was faster and less exhausting. But the chair was now a choice, not a prison. Then, on a cold January morning, a telegram arrived from the territorial capital. The governor was making an inspection tour of flood-damaged areas. He would be visiting Timber Ridge, and he wanted to meet Jacob McKenna personally. The governor arrived 3 days later with an entourage of officials and newspapermen. He was a tall, distinguished man in his 50s, with silver hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. Jacob met him on the porch of his cabin, standing with the aid of his cane. Sarah stood beside him, hope in her arms. Behind them, the entire community had gathered. "Mr. McKenna," the governor said, extending his hand, "your work here has been remarkable. The coordination, the rescue efforts, the rebuilding." "I've read all the reports. Just doing what needed doing," Jacob replied. The governor smiled. "That's what every hero says." He looked around at the assembled crowd. "I'm here to make you an offer. Regional Director of Emergency Management for all of East Tennessee, based in Knoxville. Salary of $800 per year. A house provided. Staff to assist you. The chance to implement your warning system across the entire territory." It was a fortune, a position of real power. Everything that the old Jacob, the man before the accident, would have dreamed of achieving. The crowd murmured excitedly. Henderson clapped Jacob on the back. Even Marshal Pritchard looked impressed. But Jacob looked at Sarah, at Hope, at the cabin behind them that he had built with his own hands, at the community that had become his family. "Governor, I appreciate the offer, I truly do, but my work is here." The governor's eyebrows rose. "You're turning down this position?" "I'm choosing a different one." Jacob's voice was steady. "These mountains made me who I am, broke me down, and built me back stronger. The people here trusted me when I had nothing left but my hands and my word. I won't leave them now." He paused, looking out over the valley that was slowly coming back to life. A man can chase glory his whole life and die empty, or he can build something that lasts, something that matters to people who matter to him. I choose to build." The governor studied him for a long moment. Then he smiled. "You know, Mr. McKenna, I think you might be the wisest man I've met in politics. Keep the coordinator position, keep your salary, and know that when we need advice on how to serve rather than be served, we'll come to these mountains to find it." He turned to address the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, you have a guardian here who understands that real strength is measured not by what a man can do, but by what he refuses to give up on. Protect him as he has protected you." The crowd erupted in applause. The governor shook Jacob's hand again, this time with genuine respect rather than political courtesy. After the officials left, Sarah took Jacob's arm. "You could have had everything. Money, power, a place in the capital." "I have everything," Jacob replied. He looked at Hope, at Sarah, at the home they had built together. "This, right here, this is everything." That evening, as the winter sun set over the mountains, Jacob stood on his porch without his wheelchair. His legs trembled with the effort, but they held him. Not perfectly, not the way they once had, but enough. He would never be the man he was before the accident. That man had died when the tree fell. But the man he had become was stronger in ways that mattered more. Wiser, kinder, tested by fire and water, and found worthy. "Real strength," Cherokee Joe had said, "is measured by who's still standing when you fall." Jacob McKenna was standing, and he would keep standing, in whatever way his body allowed, for as long as his people needed him, because that was what guardians did. Spring came to the Smoky Mountains in 1888 with a gentle insistence of new life. The snow melted from the high peaks, and the valley that had been scoured clean by the flood began to show hints of green. Wildflowers pushed through the mud. Saplings took root where ancient trees had fallen. The land, resilient as the people who lived on it, was healing. Jacob stood at the edge of his property, leaning on the cane he had carved from hickory wood. His right leg bore most of his weight. His left provided balance, but little more. After 6 months of daily effort, this was as good as it would get. He would never run again, never climb a tree with the ease of his youth, never be the man called Bear who could fell timber faster than any 2 men combined. But he could stand. He could walk short distances, and on mornings like this, when the air smelled of pine and possibility, that was enough. Behind him, the sound of construction filled the air. Timber Ridge was being rebuilt, and every new structure incorporated the lessons Jacob had taught them: higher foundations, reinforced walls, escape routes designed into every home. The town that rose from the flood would be stronger than the one that had fallen. Jacob's workshop had become the heart of the reconstruction. 8 men now worked under his guidance, crafting not just decorative pieces, but structural elements. Beams and joists cut to precise specifications. Furniture built to last generations. Every piece marked with the McKenna stamp, a guarantee of quality that had spread far beyond Tennessee. "Papa," a small voice called from the cabin porch. Jacob turned to see Hope toddling toward him, her chubby legs unsteady but determined. At 18 months old, she had inherited her mother's quick mind, and what Jacob liked to think was his own stubborn refusal to quit. She fell constantly while learning to walk, but got up every time without tears. Sarah followed behind, one hand resting on her swollen belly. 8 months pregnant with their second child, she moved with the careful grace of a woman who had done this before and knew what was coming. "Careful, sweetheart," Sarah called, as Hope reached Jacob. Jacob set his cane aside and knelt slowly,
his legs protesting the movement. Hope crashed into his arms with all the subtlety of a small avalanche. He held her tight, breathing in the scent of milk and sunshine that clung to all small children. "What are you building today, Papa?" Hope asked, her words still baby-soft, but increasingly clear. "Houses for people who lost theirs in the big water." "Why they lose them?" "Because sometimes things break. But breaking isn't the end. We rebuild. We make things stronger."
Hope considered this with the seriousness only a toddler could muster. "You was broke, Mama says, but you builded yourself stronger." Jacob met Sarah's eyes over Hope's head. His wife smiled, that private smile that held all the things they had survived together. "That's right, baby girl. I was broken. But I learned that the strongest parts of us aren't the parts that never break. They're the parts that break and heal and keep going anyway." Hope nodded as if this made perfect sense, then wiggled free to chase a butterfly that had landed nearby. "She's going to be a handful," Sarah said, settling beside Jacob with the care of someone whose back ached and feet swelled. "She already is." Jacob watched his daughter with undisguised affection. "Just like her mother. I was never that stubborn." "Sarah Coleman, you argued with a man twice your size while 8 months pregnant and won. You're exactly that stubborn." Sarah laughed, the sound rich and warm. "I suppose I am." They sat together in comfortable silence, watching Hope's explorations and listening to the sounds of the town coming back to life. This, Jacob thought, was what he had been building toward. Not a return to who he was, but the creation of something new, something better. A rider appeared on the trail, moving fast. As he drew closer, Jacob recognized young Caleb, now 17, and filling out into the kind of lean strength that came from hard work and mountain living. "Uncle Jacob," Caleb called, swinging down from his horse. "Marshal Pritchard needs you in town. There's been news about Hardwick." Jacob's expression hardened. The lumber magnate had been in the territorial prison in Knoxville for the past 6 months, awaiting trial on fraud charges. "What kind of news?" "He escaped 3 days ago. Pritchard got word this morning. They think he might be headed back here." The peace of the morning shattered like glass. Sarah's hand found Jacob's arm, her grip tight. "Would he really come back?" she asked. "He has to know we'd see him arrested again." "Desperate men do stupid things," Jacob replied, the words Marshal Pritchard had spoken months ago coming back to him. "And Hardwick lost everything, his mill, his money, his reputation. Men like that don't think straight." He pushed himself to his feet, reaching for his cane. "Get the word out. I want every family on alert. And find Cherokee Joe. He sees things in these mountains that others miss." Caleb rode off, and Jacob turned to Sarah. "Take Hope inside. Stay there until we know what's happening. Jacob, please." His voice was gentle but firm. "I can't coordinate defense and worry about you at the same time." Sarah searched his face, then nodded. "Be careful. Our children need their father. They need their mother, too. So you stay safe." Marshal Pritchard arrived within the hour, bringing with him a dozen armed men from town. They gathered in Jacob's workshop while he spread maps across his workbench. "If Hardwick's coming here, he'll use the mountain trails. The main road is too exposed." Jacob traced routes with his finger. "There are 3 approaches: the North Ridge, the Creek Trail, and the Southern Pass. We can't watch all 3 with the men we have," Pritchard said. "We don't need to watch. We need to funnel." Jacob marked positions on the map. "We block 2 trails. Make them obvious but not insurmountable.
Any man with woods experience will see through it and avoid those roots. Pushing him to the third trail. Exactly. The southern pass. It's narrow, with good sightlines. We can see him coming from half a mile away. Henderson, who had proven himself capable during the flood, stepped forward. You want us to set a trap? I want us to be ready. There's a difference. If Hardwick comes peacefully, we take him peacefully. But we don't give him the chance to hurt anyone. The preparation took the rest of the day. Men positioned themselves along the southern pass. Families in the valley were moved to high ground as a precaution. Jacob coordinated everything from his workshop, his mind working through contingencies and backup plans with the precision that had made him a legendary logger. As night fell, Cherokee Joe appeared at the workshop door as if summoned. "He comes tonight," the old Cherokee said, without preamble. "Brings fire and anger. Seeks what he can never have back." "How many men with him?" "Alone." Joe's dark eyes were sad. "Broken men often are." Jacob nodded slowly. A lone man was less dangerous than a group, but potentially more unpredictable. Desperation made people capable of terrible things. The hours passed slowly. Jacob waited in his cabin with Sarah and Hope, while armed men kept watch in the darkness. The moon rose full and bright, turning the forest silver. Near midnight, the signal came. 3 sharp whistles from the southern pass. Someone was approaching. Jacob emerged onto his porch, cane in hand. Marshal Pritchard and his men had taken positions around the property. Caleb stood ready with a rifle he barely knew how to use, but carried anyway. The figure that emerged from the tree line was barely recognizable as Silas Hardwick. The once prosperous lumber baron was gaunt and wild. His expensive clothes were torn and muddy. His face was haggard, eyes sunken and burning with something that might have been madness. He carried no visible weapon, but his hands were clenched into fists. "McKenna!" he called out. His voice was hoarse, as if he had been screaming. "You destroyed me." "You destroyed yourself," Jacob replied calmly. "I just refused to let you destroy me too." "I had everything," Hardwick's voice broke. "The mill, the contracts, the respect. I built an empire in these mountains. Now it's gone, all of it, because of you and your flood. The flood wasn't my doing. Nature doesn't take sides, but you survived." Hardwick laughed, a sound with no humor in it. "The cripple on the mountain survives, while the strongest man in the valley loses everything. Where's the justice in that?" Jacob leaned on his cane, studying the broken man before him. "There's no justice in floods, Silas. No fairness in accidents or disasters. But there's choice in how we respond. I chose to adapt, to build. You chose to take and threaten and hurt. Our outcomes reflect our choices." Hardwick took a step forward. Marshal Pritchard's men tensed, but Jacob raised a hand, stopping them. "You want justice?" Jacob continued. "Then turn yourself in. Face the law. Serve your sentence. Come out the other side and build something honest. It's not too late." For a moment, something flickered in Hardwick's eyes, something that might have been hope or recognition. Then it died. "Too late? I'm 50 years old and I have nothing, not even my dignity." Hardwick's shoulders sagged. "What's the point of going on?" "The point is tomorrow," Jacob said quietly, "and the day after that, and all the days that follow, where you get to choose again." I was broken too, Silas, crushed under a tree, lost the use of my legs, lost everything I thought made me who I was. But I found out that who we are isn't about what we can do.
It's about what we refuse to give up on. What did you refuse to give up on? Hope. Jacob's voice was steady. The belief that tomorrow could be better than today if I worked to make it so. Hardwick stared at him for a long moment. Then, slowly, the fight went out of him. He sank to his knees in the mud, his face in his hands. "I'm sorry." The words came out broken. "For the threats, for trying to take your home, for everything. I'm so tired." Marshal Pritchard moved forward slowly, manacles in hand. "Silas Hardwick, you're under arrest for escape from lawful custody. Will you come peacefully?" Hardwick nodded, not resisting as the cuffs closed around his wrists. As Pritchard led him away, Hardwick looked back at Jacob one last time. "How did you do it? How did you find the strength?" "I didn't find it," Jacob replied. "I built it, one choice at a time, one day at a time, until the choices became habits and the habits became character." After they were gone, Sarah emerged from the cabin with Hope sleeping in her arms. She stood beside Jacob on the porch, looking out at the moonlit forest. "Do you think he'll make it?" she asked softly. "Do you think he'll find his way back?" "I don't know, but I hope so. Nobody is beyond redemption if they're willing to do the work." The next morning brought news from Knoxville. The territorial court had reviewed all the testimony gathered by the people of Timber Ridge. Hardwick would face trial not just for fraud, but for attempted arson, extortion, and a dozen other charges. The evidence was overwhelming. Justice, delayed by 6 months, would finally be served. But more importantly, the court had ruled that all debts owed to Hardwick's company were void due to illegal contract manipulation. 15 families were suddenly free of crushing loans. Land that had been in danger of seizure was secured to its rightful owners. The celebration in Timber Ridge lasted 3 days. There was music and dancing and more food than the recovering town could easily spare. But the joy was irrepressible. They had survived flood and threat and fear. They had held together when everything tried to tear them apart. On the 3rd night of celebration, as the music played and children ran wild in the firelight, Jacob sat with Sarah on the cabin porch. Hope was asleep inside. The new baby would arrive any day now. Dr. Marcus Henley had written again the week before. His letter contained the results of a medical study he had published about patients with spinal injuries. Jacob's case was featured, though his name was changed to protect privacy. The doctor's conclusion was simple. Physical recovery was important, but psychological recovery was essential. Patients who found purpose and community had better outcomes than those who focused solely on returning to their former physical state. The letter included an invitation. Would Jacob consider speaking at a medical conference in Pittsburgh? Sharing his story might help other patients understand that healing took many forms. "Are you going to accept?" Sarah asked, her hand finding his in the darkness. "Maybe. Someday, if it helps someone else." Jacob squeezed her fingers gently. "But not until after this baby comes. And not until spring planting is done. And not until the new church is built and the school is reopened and you found every excuse to stay home, because this is where you belong." Jacob smiled. That, too. They sat in silence, listening to the music and laughter floating up from the town below. The community they had helped save. The life they had built from nothing. The future that stretched ahead with all its uncertainty and promise. "I never thanked you," Jacob said suddenly. "For what?" "For seeing me when I couldn't see myself. For believing I was more than my broken body. for teaching me that strength isn't about standing on your own 2 feet. It's about knowing when to lean on others. Sarah leaned her head against his shoulder. We taught each other. I was broken too when we met, widowed and pregnant and terrified. You gave me a home, a purpose, a partnership. We built each other back. Maybe that's what family is. Not the people who stand with you when you're strong, but the people who help you stand when you're broken. Cherokee Joe's words from months ago came back to Jacob. The mountain gave you back your legs, but you gave the mountain your heart first. He understood now what the old man had meant. His legs had healed to some degree because he had stopped obsessing over them, had focused instead on what he could do rather than what he could not, had given himself to something larger than his own recovery, and in giving himself away, he had found himself again. The baby came 2 weeks later, another girl. They named her Grace, after the grace they had both received. The undeserved kindness of a second chance, the mercy of survival, the gift of a love neither had expected but both had earned. Jacob held Grace in the same workshop where he had once carved her sister's cradle. His hands, scarred from rope and wood and hard living, cradled her with infinite gentleness. Hope toddled over to peer at her new sister. "Baby," she announced with authority. "That's right, your baby sister. You have to help take care of her. I teach her to walk, like you teach me." Jacob's throat tightened. "Yes, sweetheart, you teach her to walk. Show her that falling down isn't failing. Getting up is what matters." Over the next months, the rhythm of their life became something close to contentment. The workshop prospered. The early warning system Jacob had designed was installed throughout the mountain region. His reputation as the man who had climbed a tower on broken legs spread far beyond Tennessee. People came from distant places to meet him. Some wanted to hear his story. Some wanted advice on their own struggles. Some just wanted to see if the legend was real. Jacob welcomed them all, shared his experience honestly, without embellishment, told them about the despair and the fear and the long climb back, told them that recovery wasn't a straight line, that some days he could barely stand and other days he walked without his cane, that the journey never really ended. But mostly, he told them about hope, not the blind optimism that denied pain, but the stubborn determination to keep moving forward, even when the path was unclear. On Hope's second birthday, the entire town gathered at the McKenna cabin for a celebration. The house Jacob had built for a broken man and a desperate woman now overflowed with family and friends and laughter. As the sun set and the stars emerged, Jacob stood on his porch watching the scene. Hope played with other children in the yard. Grace slept in Sarah's arms inside. Around them, the community they had saved continued its work of living and building and hoping. Marshal Pritchard approached, a cup of cider in each hand. He offered one to Jacob. "To the guardian of the mountain," Pritchard said, raising his cup. "Just a man doing what needed doing." That's what every hero says. Pritchard's expression was serious. "You know what I realized watching you these past 2 years? Strength isn't the ability to do great things when you're whole. It's the refusal to quit when you're broken. You taught us all that." Jacob thought about the man he had been, the legendary logger called Bear, the strongest in the territory, the man who had believed his worth was measured by what his body could accomplish. That man had died under a falling tree, but in his place had risen someone better, someone who understood that real strength was measured not by what you lifted, but by who you lifted up, not by how high you climbed, but by how many you brought with you. Real strength is measured by who's still standing when you fall, Cherokee Joe had said. Jacob McKenna was standing, not perfectly, not the way he once had, but standing nonetheless.
And all around him stood the people he had refused to let fall, the community he had saved and that had saved him in return, the family he had built from broken pieces, the legacy that would outlast any amount of physical strength. As the last light faded from the sky and the first stars emerged, Sarah stepped onto the porch. She carried Grace in one arm and took Jacob's hand with her other. "What are you thinking about?" she asked.
Everything. Nothing. How lucky I am. Jacob looked at his family, his friends, his home. 6 years ago, I was the strongest man in these mountains, and I thought I had everything. I was wrong. I had nothing that mattered. Now I'm half crippled and barely able to walk, and I have everything that does. You climbed that tower to save them, Sarah said softly, nodding toward the town below. But you know what I think? They saved you first. Jacob pulled her close, careful of the baby between them. Maybe we all saved each other. That night, after everyone had gone home and the children were asleep, Jacob made his evening inspection of the property. He moved slowly with his cane, checking that fires were banked and doors were secured, and all was well. At the edge of the clearing he paused. From here he could see the valley stretching away in moonlight. New homes dotted the landscape where old ones had fallen. Fields were cleared and ready for spring planting. The creek ran clear and peaceful in its new channel. Everything had changed. Everything had been rebuilt. Not to what it was, but to what it could be. Just like him. Jacob McKenna turned back toward his cabin, toward his wife and daughters, toward the life he had built from disaster and determination and the stubborn refusal to surrender. His legs were broken, they always would be to some degree, but the man who walked on them was stronger than the man who had run, because now he knew what mattered. And what mattered was not the body that carried you through life, but the life you built despite the body's limitations. He had climbed that tower when everyone said it was impossible. He had saved his town when he could barely save himself. He had built a family and a business and a legacy that would outlast his bones. And if a tree fell on him again tomorrow, if disaster struck and everything was lost, he would do it all again. Would climb whatever tower needed climbing, would save whoever needed saving, would rebuild whatever needed rebuilding, because that was what guardians did, not because they were strong, but because they refused to be anything less than what their people needed them to be. The cabin door opened and Sarah's silhouette appeared, backlit by the warm glow inside. Coming to bed? In a minute. A shadow moved at the edge of the forest. Cherokee Joe stepped into the moonlight, looking older, more translucent, as if the mountains were calling him home. "Jacob," the old man said softly. "Joe, you came to say goodbye." "Not goodbye. See you when you climb your last mountain. I'll be waiting at the top." Joe touched the bear carving hanging from Jacob's belt. "You are guardian. You always were, even when you couldn't see it." Then Cherokee Joe turned and walked into the forest, not disappearing, just returning to where he belonged. Jacob watched until the trees swallowed him, then raised his hand in silent salute. "Thank you," he whispered. For everything, Jacob took one last look at the stars above and the valley below. Then he turned toward home, toward love, toward the tomorrow that he would build with his broken body and unbroken spirit. Some things, he had learned, were worth more than walking, worth more than strength or status or the person you used to be.
They were worth everything. And he had found them all in the last place he expected. In a wheelchair. In a desperate marriage. In a flooded valley. In a tower he should never have been able to climb. In becoming less than he was, Jacob McKenna had become more than he ever imagined possible. And that, he thought, as he climbed the steps to his porch, was the only legacy that truly mattered. The legacy of refusing to fall, even when you could not stand, especially then.